Welcome to Passionate Reply, and welcome to Great Albums. Today we'll be looking at a relative curiosity, Signals from Afar by the Shortwave Mystery, initially recorded between 1983 and 1985, but not properly mastered and released until 2011. The Shortwave Mystery were one of the innumerable music groups that sprung up for a few years and left behind little more than a self-released 12-inch single by the time they broke up. It's a common fate for small-time acts, but in some sense they may actually have been better off in the 20th century than they are now. A contemporary artist might leave only digital files, vulnerable to data losses like the one suffered during MySpace's failed server migration in 2018. The Shortwave Mystery were at least kind enough to give posterity a single physical artifact of their existence in the form of their 1985 single, Pilots. While Pilots shows a lot of promise with its insistent wall of hammering synth, it also seems to lose quite a bit from its very muddy vocals. As far as I can tell, this effect seems unintentional and merely a byproduct of amateurs' inability to access superior recording equipment. It's worth noting that Signals from Afar also features a new version of Pilots which does away with this completely and provides a higher fidelity vocal track for better or for worse. Warts and all, Pilots won some underground club play, eventually becoming an item of substantial interest during the rediscovery and revival of so-called dark wave or minimal synth music in the 21st century, which was and is quick to hail similarly obscure or semi-anonymous works as gems worth preserving. It was in this context that the Shortwave Mystery were rediscovered, and the other assorted demos they recorded during the mid-1980s were finally given a proper production treatment and released to the world. Tracks like Special Girl are dominated by a throbbing, incessant synth backing which is satisfyingly similar to what we hear on Pilots. The combination of 80s recording and 10s mastering gives this album a mesmerizing and unique effect. All the brazenness of the simplistic and primitive early synthesizer, combined with the crispness and precision of sophisticated digital production. Special Girl, in particular, has a relatively simple compositional structure, and one which I think really lets the sonic qualities of Signals from Afar shine. It has a straightforwardness, or perhaps a single-mindedness that feels direct and concise, a quality which I think is often found in the works of entirely unprofessional or amateur musicians. The gothic dread of Special Girl is uninhibited, perhaps even indulgent in its fullness. It's also not the only track on the album to deal with dark themes. Take, for example, Turn Time Away. Turn Time Away portrays people who have lost love and hence retreated from society. This is no ordinary bout of depression, but rather something implied to have a supernatural dimension to it. Something that exiles its sufferers outside the boundaries of time and space. This is, of course, quite fitting for an album which is also, in its own way, outside of time. Also fitting is the track's sense of atmosphere. While it retains the harsh, bright synth textures heard on Special Girl, its vortical runs give it an unnerving sense of high tension, and contrast with the slower pace motif that introduces the track. Still, not everything on Signals from Afar is so steeped in gloom and doom. A number of them are actually quite playful, such as Scooby Ruby.
Scooby Ruby. Scooby Ruby. Scooby Ruby.
With rubbery synth and hints at a pentatonic scale, Scooby Ruby sounds a bit like the seminal work of Yellow Magic Orchestra. Childlike samples take the place of lead vocals in this track, and they seem to add a note of naivete or innocence. Unlike many instances of sampling, which serve to make us reevaluate cinematic dialogue or the content of some politician's speech, there is no apparent significance to the syllables being said, aside from a brief incidence of "I love you," which is a bit buried. Much as Special Girl is nakedly gothic, reveling in the pure fun of making something spooky, Scooby Ruby is upfront about its trifling nature. It is undoubtedly one of the album's more experimental tracks, conceived before sampling and penetrated mainstream music to a heavier degree, but it doesn't come across as challenging or difficult. It sounds like something made for the joy of making it, and the sense of joy is an infectious one. Still, there's a certain provocative element to Scooby Ruby as well. Note the apparent sample of a sneeze. While Scooby Ruby combines sampling with a fairly accessible, bouncy melody, there are also some less friendly, sample-heavy tracks, such as the album's opener and title track. Not sure whether the title of Signals from Afar had been decided upon back in the 1980s or was assigned to it in the 2010s with a knowing note of irony, but either way I quite like it. Regardless, the track of the same name is a satisfying combination of the sample-oriented structure of Scooby Ruby and the melancholia of Turn Time Away. Unlike the more quotidian sounds of Scooby Ruby, the title track prominently features samples of Franklin Delano Roosevelt denouncing war. Free in between two major instances of sampling, the music itself seems to take the form of a kind of broadcast intrusion. Is it a signal emerging from a sea of noise, or an ungainly interruption of the signals of real importance? While it's subtle in the context of the mix, you can also pick out the use of telegraph sounds at times, adding to the overall theme of telecommunication. Overall, the mood of the title track seems ambiguous, especially compared to the other tracks. The vocals are downbeat, but also somewhat wistful. The cover of Signals from Afar is ambiguous and open to interpretation as well. It shows a woman operating a telegraph with half of her face covered ominously in shadow. Her expression seems neutral or perhaps a bit stiff, but we might read into it a sense of trepidation or seriousness. Might she be delivering bad news to someone, or perhaps receiving it? The pins on her collar seems to suggest that she is a member of a military organization, which could make the significance of her message all the more grave. Could she be reporting on the loss of some battle, a terrible massacre, or the threat of an incoming bomb? She is also surrounded by darkness with no apparent background to speak of, a decision that puts all the more emphasis on her expression and what it might say about her internality in this critical moment. Tantalizing in its incompleteness and suggestion of a greater narrative, this image deals in similar themes as the album does: communication, technology, and despair. The Shortwave Mystery were one of many groups who created unrealized music, one of many groups whose works were rediscovered and made available by diligent enthusiasts decades later, and ultimately one of many groups who used this period of tremendous archival re-releases to attempt to kickstart a new career. In this case, it was that of Gregory Windrum Scoggin, who, as far as we know, was the chief creative contributor behind the small Shortwave Mystery catalog. In 2012, he released a new composition, the single Sarah Good's Lament, based on the fate of one of the victims of the infamous Salem witch trials. Ultimately, though, the cult following of minimal synth caught up with Wyndham Scoggin just a little too late, as he would perish before his time in a tragic motorcycle accident in 2014. What else he might have accomplished upon re-entry into a brand new musical world, we'll never know. The label that did the remastering and releasing of Signals from Afar, and which also published Sarah Good's Lament, was not long for this world either. Unlike many of the labels that started during this era and are still going strong, like Minimal Wave and Dark Entries, the California-based World Service Collective appears to be defunct, with its official website cited on Discogs.com apparently up for sale. World Service Collective never released anything else, aside from these scant few items directly pertaining to the Shortwave Mystery. The Roman poet Juvenal famously asked, "Who will guard the guards themselves?" The dead end of this sorry tale asks us a similar question about art. When the archivists have gone, who will be left to archive their stories? To close on a lighter note, my favorite track on Signals from Afar is Segway. You might assume that an instrumental track called Segway will be nothing more than a seconds-long jingle dividing one major composition from another, but Segway is anything but. It's a well-formed instrumental track, and I think that the instrumental context goes a long way to show off what the Shortwave Mystery really did best. Those big, pounding synth arrangements. That's everything for today. Thanks for listening.